All right. Poetry reading. Any distinction between song lyrics and poetry is in the mystic context of music. When you ululate words in play with a musical instrument, or even just the naked voice a cappella in song, those words become lyrics to a song. Without the alchemy, the words are in solitude and servitude as a poem, defined by the visionary intention as language on the page, in the mind, or on the tongue. Both expressions, one in music, the other without, like any natural occurrence or creative grace, may be in essence poetry. The rock and roll lyric, as read alone on the page without the musical noise, is not necessarily going to function as a poem. When it hits the microphone with musical interaction, it is a celebration liberated beyond any formal construct of what a poem historically is said to be. Hip-hop in poetry in now time, alive and dependent on voice, attitude, and breath. Whether it reads as poetry in any refined state of measure or line break is inconsequential to the desire for freedom, fury, and love. Like rock and roll, hip-hop is poetry on fire. We use our language, our vocabulary in consideration and in practice to personal or shared systems and parameters, wild or academic, to write the poem. When that fine, fine music makes honey drip, we write the song lyric. At 10 years old, in 1968, I understood poetry to be a pantheon of styles as gleaned from large tomes of collected verse in my father's library. Most alluring was the quote-unquote nonsense poems of Edward Lear, The Owl and the Pussycat Went to Sea in a Beautiful Pea-Green Boat. The romance, confession, and melancholy of classic traditional pre-modernist poetry also impressed a stylistic seriousness upon my cognitive sense. My first vivid memories are of early 70s summers when I'd write poems about horses and dogs and gentle pleasures on yellow-lined tablet paper. Any earlier writings would have been a letter to the editors of DC Comics in plea to kindly reconsider the discontinuation of a particular superhero series. I recall reading such a missive aloud to my bemused mother, and her slight smile toward her youngest crew-cut boy reaching out beyond his 1960s bedroom. I was too young then to feel the words of Bob Dylan beside the alluring refrain of "Everybody must get stoned." However, I remember the intrigue of the Rolling Stones' Jumpin' Jack Flash. Was it the strange otherland nature and weird alliteration of that title? Was it a person or a state of action? Something of both, I would come to realize. Most hits of the 60s were not so challenging or evocative, but I was curious what more there could be outside the easily understood delights of Light My Fire, Hey Jude, and Yummy, Yummy, Yummy. The first song lyrics to seduce my consciousness were by Lou Reed, Alice Cooper, Iggy Pop, Nico, David Bowie, Brian Ferry, Eno, Ron Mayle, David Johansen, Andy Chernoff, Patti Smith, Richard Hell, the Ramones, Tom Verlaine, Johnny Rotten, and Alan Vega. Mostly men, but that would change forcibly and remarkably with punk, post-punk, no wave, new wave, hardcore, riot girl, et al. When the Slits, the Raincoats, Lydia Lunch, Susie Sue, Exene Cervenka, Bikini Kill reconfigured the imbalance of gender and rock and roll expression. Locating the first Velvet Underground and Stooges LPs amongst the orthodoxy of safe hippie rock in their record store bins almost seemed like they were there by error. It felt risky, if not risque, purchasing these obviously oddball sides. For young seekers of subversive pleasures, it was to our benefit that these particular documents were fairly discounted amidst the more popular competitors. The Egg Bemyasi LP by German underground rock avant-gardist Can, Captain Beefheart's The Spotlight Kid, the Stooges' first LP, and other similarly shocking, mind-zapping albums were incredible payoffs. Amongst the dross in those cheap bins. You chose them for their covers, or by recognizing them from the wild, glossy pages of rock mags, or simply by one's own inherent radical rock and roll radar. But you chose them and their delinquent, non-selling, bad behavior relegation. They became your secret weirdo friends. No one else in school listened to those records. It was all the Allman Brothers Band. Yes, BTO, Deep Purple, Led Zepp, Sab, and Floyd. You kept them close, but were wary of sharing them because you knew no one would understand why they appealed to you. Even you didn't know why. I read any and every lyric sheet from the back jacket of Sgt. Pepper's to my stolen copy of the Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street songbook, and would pore over the strange, clumsy white junk blues, phrasing so audibly unintelligible through Jagger's slur. Hit Parader magazine's primary content was lyrics to the hits of the day, though it would break boundaries sometimes and publish lyrics to a selection of songs one hardly heard on the radio. I read every word, at times adding my own melody to those lyrics of songs I had not yet heard. The zoned-out minimalism of Iggy singing, "Another year for me and you, another year with nothing to do, and maybe go out, maybe stay home, maybe call Mom on the telephone," on the first Stooges LP was an arrow into a section of the heart that Ramblin' Man by the Allman Brothers Band could not come near, or cared, or dared to. Iggy was an urban voice of disaffection and social alienation, not an escape to the country to sing songs on a rustic porch with a dog a la Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, or James Taylor. When Iggy howls, "Anne, my Anne, I love you right now," in the song Anne, you know he understands the obsession you have with that girl who'll never return your crazed inner desire because you're too much of a fucking freak. Iggy Pop is a poet, a literate kid who had a schoolteacher dad and a marvelous mother. He was turned on by the lyrics of country blues, the acid vision verse of Jim Morrison, and the space is the place cosmos chants of Sun Ra and the orchestra. Soul, blood, confusion, glitter, trash, and guts. A broken glass bisecting the chest where the lyrics drip out to splatter your turntable. Lou Reed came out of university with a love of what poetry was, is, and could be, especially in the powerful elixir mystery that is rock and roll. On European Sun from the Velvet Underground and Nico LP, he name-checks Delmore Schwartz, the American poet of In Dreams Begin Responsibilities, with whom Lou had an emotional and scholarly acquaintance. I found the lyrics on the VU and Nico LPs beguiling as they walked the line of savagery and love, decadence and purposeful cornballism. Heroin and whippings were not in my worldview as a teenager in rural Connecticut, but I processed this New York City styling as native to the location's rich tailoring lineage, where beat poets and writers and Lou all lived. William S. Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, and Gregory Corso came into focus by reading any and all rock periodicals that featured pieces on Lou Reed and the Velvets. Cream magazine had a special cover issue in the early 70s entitled Androgyny and Rock, and in the litany of characters was a picture of Burroughs, where he was touted as being responsible for turning an entire generation into faggot junkies. This is what led me to speedily drive hours away to the bookstore that carried his work. I rode with my classmate Harold, who was the only outwardly gay kid in my high school, and eventually my best friend. In the car, I read aloud to him from Burroughs's Naked Lunch in amazement as we laughed and smoked joints and Winstons with the 8-track stereo blaring Lou's Rock and Roll Animal. It all blossoms to wildfire at this point. In 1975, Cream publishes poems by rock writer Patti Smith, then always lowercase, Patti Smith, a poet text move, black and white and bare and tough. She had released the 7-inch Hey Joe, backed with Piss Factory, which we had to mail order, 2 tracks of recitation, heavy off-the-cuff songs with straight-in-the-groove poetry. Patti was a rock writer in league with Lester Bangs, Richard Meltzer, and other wild-like Cream scribes, all equal in inspirational and intellectual value as the rock and rollers who they would critique, analyze, and take to task in post-gonzo literary style that naturally, and at times chemically, fused poet tongue with jazz improvisation and raunch and roll energy. The Patti record was immediately followed by the television 7-inch Little Johnny Jewel by guitarist writer Tom Verlaine, last name borrowed from the French symbolist poet. Our teenaged brains must investigate, singing lines of stunning evocation where the valleys of the city are under the spell of gas hallucinogens and UFOs hover beneath the light-thudded night sky. All that guy ever said is, "I want my little wing head." And then the Blank Generation 7-inch EP by Richard Hell and the Voidoids. Hell's lyrics were the mania and wild world pinball meter. Which Verlaine's lyrics had stripped. These boys had lived and worked and writ together, and Patti was scrawling betwixt them. There was absolutely nothing I could do but finally pack up everything and commit to an apartment on 13th Street between Avenues A and B for $108 a month. It was the springtime of 1977, and I was overdue on securing a place of my own. Since mid-1976, I had been crashing on the loft floor of some Rhode Island School of Design graduate students whom I had met while searching out Velvet's, Flamin' Groovies, and Runaways LPs at Cutler's Record Store in New Haven, Connecticut. Richard Hell had the best name. His name is like a title of a poem. It sounded demonic, and it was funny, smart, and deliberately devious. When I first heard him yelp, I was saying, "Let me out of here," before I was even born. On the song Blank Generation, it truly was a dog boy call to arms. It was what I imagined he'd sound like, although nothing had prepared me for it. Even the howlin' wolf up and down growling hoot styling of Captain Beefheart, or Iggy's scuzz coke and leather and cigarette snarl on "Your Pretty Face is Going to Hell" had not prepared me for the audacious wildness of Hell's new punk cry. Intelligent, fun, crazed, and high, or drunk, or both. At first, I noticed Hell used a disproportionate amount of parentheses marks in his titles because they were something in rock songs he saw as elements to fetishize, and that is what a poet does. It is the crux of the visual and poetics where the concrete and language, Language, sensibility, may as well evolve. with punk lyricism, a somewhat self-conscious neo-sophisticate discipline, in all its brazen delight, in both crudity and self-referential poetics, it is curious to me how the Ramones, particularly on their first LP, wrote such masterful examples of true minimalism. As young street punks from the 70s Queens, New York, it is improbable that they had any connection to the less is more aesthetic of the minimalist poetry of Aram Saroyan, or his infamous and legendary 1965 one-word poem, Light, Lighght. It was also unlikely that they had been introduced to future American super-literary agent Andrew Wiley, who also wrote early minimal exercises in verse such as black, skin black, light, black leather, jackets. This short poem was published by Telegraph Books, the same imprint that released Seventh Heaven by Patti Smith. Both Andrew Wiley and Patti traveled to London in 1972 with New York poets Gerard Malanga and Victor Bacchus, where they read at the legendary Better Books shop. The Ramones realized with organic sense that the minimalism of their chord structures could only succeed with likened lyrics, and we were gifted to, I don't want to walk around with you, I don't want to walk around with you, I don't want to walk around with you, so why you want to walk around with me? This seems utterly eviscerating and in fabulous contrast to the dominant bloat of Led Zepp's if there's a bustle in your hedgerow, don't be alarmed now. It's just a spring clean for the May Queen. England was a series of explosions of noise and great, great lyrics, which the Sex Pistols, the Damned, and the Clash would refute as poetry, because that's just a bunch of New York hippie spew. They present their words instead as incendiary tracts, slogans, and linguistic scythes across the oh-so-polite stinkscape of a country mired in misery and bickering social stigma. We had no concept of England beyond Bowie's glamorous discolored eyeball. But to hear the Buzzcocks sing a song entitled Boredom was bloody exciting, and the Sex Pistols to deliver on their hype promise with the off-putting rhyme disregard of I am the Antichrist, I am an anarchist, followed by the insolent bravado of don't know what I want, but I know how to get it. I want to destroy the passerby. It was a voice from a broken mirror. It didn't matter if Johnny Rotten considered his lyrics to be poetry, or had ever even read the stuff, or had pooh-poohed the New York school, berating Patti as a barefoot hippie poet. He was writing lines of new amped poetry, rock and roll, whether he thinks he did or not. Never mind the bollocks, here's the Sex Pistols is as great and legendary a work of noise and text than any accepted contender in rock and roll history, be it Blonde or Blonde, or Nevermind. Harold and I would write poems while listening to records all night, taking blotter acid and smoking joint after joint. We weren't lovers, but I loved him. His poems were based on the exact meters and sometimes lifted phrasings from Bowie, Eno, and Roxy Music tunes. Mine were more in the Patti Hell Verlaine world, the comic book pow of the Ramones, beat on the brat, beat on the brat, and Andy Chernoff of the Dictators. We're the members of the master race. We got no style, we got no grace. Was as much an influence in my giddy head as the spooky seduction of Patti's Jesus died for somebody's sins, but not mine. A good line is a good poem. In 1977, at 19 years of age, my awareness of the poets of New York City, specifically those in cohabitation with the Poetry Project at St. Mark's Church on the Bowery, was peripheral at best. I would hit Gotham Book Mart uptown because that's where Patti would hang, and they had published her stuff. I'd basically just go and look for the broadsides and hopefully one day her. I didn't have much money, so before any bookstore, whether Gotham Books, The Strand, St. Mark's Books, Eastside Books, or the Phoenix Bookshop, I would first hit a record store to procure the new Adverts, or Residence, or Diva, or Generation X, or Mumps, or Sonic's Rendezvous Band single. Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky lived around the corner on 12th Street, and I'd watch them strolling hand in hand. Ted Berrigan would stand in front of Gem Spa on St. Mark's Place and 2nd Avenue with a cigarette spilling ash into his beard and talking with a buzzing knowledge to a host of young poets at his hem. I didn't know who he was. I figured he was a holdover from the post-Nam era of hippie cult leaders who would still carouse the streets of the city's acolytes in a dream tow with a dusty wake. I remember a Richard Hell and the Voidoids gig in 1977 at CBGB where a young, visiting, and hot Elvis Costello jumped on the stage. Hell was in quite a lit mood that night and began his set by paraphrasing a Ted Berrigan List poem on the beatific banalities of the wonderful day, waking up, drinking a Coke, etc. As he knew Ted was in the audience, at that time I credited the poem to Hell's word charm, as I knew nada about Berrigan, and I am still fairly sure I was not the only punk ignorant. But it was only a decade and a half later when I would become obsessive in a fierce investigation into the New York school poetry beginning in the 50s, writings of Frank O'Hara, Leroy Jones, Allen Ginsberg, and Diane DePrima. I became fully aware of Ted Berrigan and saw anything he had ever written, as well as the other New York poets from the 60s and 70s, including Anne Waldman, Ron Padgett, Bernadette Mayer, Lewis Warsh, Tony Toll, Alice Notley, and then I found poets everywhere. In Cleveland, Ohio, there was D.A. Levy, D.R. Wagner, T.L. Chris, Kent Taylor, and in Detroit, Michigan, John and Lenny Sinclair and the Artist Workshop Press. In SF, poets Philip Whalen, Michael McClure, Richard Kretsch, Lou Welch stood out with so many others. Across the border in Canada, B.P. Nicol, Bill Bissett, and Steve McCaffrey's work appeared to me as a new reason to travel there. And in England, I discovered Tom Rayworth and Lee Harwood, Tina Morris, and Tom Pickard. The small presses Runcible Spoon, Angel Hair, Weed Flower, Open Skull, Seven Flowers et al. That published these writers were as critical as the small labels that released independent punk records. The illumination of the poet as devotional to language, whether it be wild mystery or charged by an academic energy, connected with my intrigue and structure and cool beauty. The shared and personal concepts of lines on the page, both confessional and visual, had an inherent history that had as much to do with radical underground action as any surrealist CBGB dweller. Here was a community with roots in anarchism, communism, Catholicism, Judaica, sex, love, protest, engagement, dislocation, drugs, drink, poverty, hair, jazz, and being in the glorious moment where the rain and sun dance the days into night and dream investigations bring it all back home. To be a poet, to even want to be a poet, made me drunk to a new world of study and desire. The realization that poetry for a writer is essentially what led me into wanting to not only archive the ephemera of my interests, but to work in tandem with the romantic community outside my New York City window, writing, publishing, and integrating. Before poetry seduced my senses, I fully preoccupied my time as a deep burrowing record collector, focusing first on the indie underground side of Sonic Youth's contemporaries, from the mysterious American punk arcana of the Pagans, the Mentally Ill, Unnatural Acts, and the Fix, to lost outsider music artifacts from anywhere and everywhere. Later, my obsession was jazz, a music that had a wealth of history of artist-run production long before punk and no wave. This led into more esoteric archiving of 20th century avant-garde composition and loner stoner intellectual folk and blues inventions. The catalyst for me was through other enthusiasts and obsessives, and in particular the jazz editor of Forced Exposure magazine, Byron Coley. He would not only turn me on to radical jazz and folk record collecting, but eventually the netherworld of post-war underground poetry publications. I had seen Byron's byline throughout the 80s in various fanzines, such as New York Rocker, Take It, and Boston Rock. When I first started playing bass in Lydia Lunch's 1983 slowed down Death Kitten concern In Limbo, along with Pat Place, and the Contortions and the Bush Tetras, and Richard Edson, who was the first Sonic Youth drummer and was a poet at St. Mark's Poetry Project. He was in Conk, and Jim Sclavunos from Teenage Jesus and the Jerks and Eight-Eyed Spy and countless other no-wave ensembles. Lydia and Jim would sometimes spark my interest with mentions of this wild man, Byron Coley, as he had road managed Eight-Eyed Spy on their 70s tour of the West Coast, when Lydia was apparently under a daily influence of LSD and boy gobble. It wasn't until my first visit to Los Angeles in 1982, when I stopped into Rhino Records where Byron was employed, that I finally met the dude face to face. He had previously sent a couple of measly bucks to my Eldridge Street apartment address, which I printed on Sonic Youth's lyric sheet insert in Confusion is Sex, requesting a copy of my fanzine, Killer. Only the most maniacal of collectors might have been aware of this obscure publication, likely from a listing in the litany of received fanzines in some other fanzine, such as LA's Flipside or San Francisco's Maximum Rock and Roll, two of the more prominent punk and hardcore fanzines in underground USA at the time. Fanzines were the literary message boards for the punk rock subterranean scene, with hardcore becoming a rampant stylistic call to outsider youth everywhere in the early 80s. New fanzines were being made in every little bohunk town across the 51 states. We made them, traded them, collected them, and spread the news. Byron and I became fast friends, and he soon moved with his wife Lily to the Boston area in Massachusetts because, as he claimed, there were more jazz records on the East Coast. He connected with Jimmy Johnson, editor of Forced Exposure fanzine, then primarily a voice for the local hardcore scene, and those two transformed that mag into a high-energy travelogue of the new post-punk intelligentsia. In a very real sense, it was the Bible for any alternative band up and coming during the 1980s. On tour, in the van, driving in the dead of night, winging through mid-America, flipping through radio stations and hearing the jazz radio DJs back-announce aired recordings, I am intrigued as each and every player was name-checked, never the case on pop rock radio. The first jazz records I held and studied were the thick, gloss, gatefold Impulse label releases of John Coltrane from the 1960s. They were serious, with sophisticated graphics and titles such as Meditations, Impressions, A Love Supreme, Kulu Se Mama, which had a spirit sensuality that appealed to my heart, even though it was beating beneath a Black Flag t-shirt. Placing those records on the turntable and hearing them with strange new curiosity was the feeling of timeless information rubbing into my youth core sensors. On tour, I found a copy of Leroy Jones's Black Music tome and his writings on Sonny Rollins, Don Cherry, Charles Mingus, Ornette Coleman, and Albert Ayler, and read it on the flight back east. Those words about that music sent me into an agitated headspace so intense I began concentrating on the pilot of the airplane to accelerate, fly faster, faster, so that we could land sooner, and I could get into some new heavy rummaging in Sounds and Free Being record stores and all the other record stores with thousands of secondhand sides, which New York City had so many of in those days. Around the same time, I had asked Byron to compile a cassette tape of what he considered the most significant jazz recordings. I required this for an upcoming Sonic Youth tour. He made a shoebox full of cassettes, each one annotated in ink. That summer, I was into complete jazz freak immersion. In the early 90s, we're visiting Western Massachusetts, where Byron and his family have moved. We had been spending years buying, selling, trading records and books. mostly beat, some sci-fi, and other weirdo rock mag stuff. But on this day, he hands me a copy of a small pamphlet poetry publication from mid-60s by the Cleveland-based radical marijuana Buddha bard D.A. Levy, lowercase, like Patty, though a good 10 years prior, and says that he probably shouldn't show me this. And then Byron extols a brief primer on the world of underground small press poetry that is coexistent with, yet far more obscure than, the commonly known beat counterculture scene of Allen Ginsberg or Charles Bukowski. I feign a slight curiosity and agree that I have way too much on my collector plate to even consider going near this obviously very beatnik, hip, and fading world of ephemera and poetry, sex, life, mystery, nexus. I may have convinced myself for a moment to have some discipline as such, but the Levy book was tantalizing. Within a week, I was prowling the used bookstore aisles of New England in search of the secondary and tertiary beat poets very few had seemed to have heard of. At the time, there was no real study on this lost world, and we began to follow whatever leads we could by seeking the documents anywhere, everywhere, high and low. The only book that dealt with it in any regard was a 1970 publication by Hugh Fox titled The Living Underground, and that alone was a considerable challenge to locate. Touring across the USA allowed me to hit every college town bookstore possible, pulling anything that was mimeographed and stapled and smacked of 60s or 70s experimental poetry off the shelves. Names became familiar in their serial inclusions: Clark Coolidge, Carol Berger, Douglas Blazek, Gerard Malonga, Joanne Kiger, David Meltzer, Ed Sanders, The Willie, Anselm Hollow, Ann Menebroker, Ben Hyatt, Tom Clark, Maureen Owen, John Giorno, Charles Potts, Ann Waldman, Bill Berkson, Louis McAdams, Wally Depew, Thule Kupferberg, John Wieners, Bill Knott, Larry Fagan, on and on and on. And the rags were pennies per pound, stacked in the farthest and mustiest corners of the poetry section. The printed poems in these journals were not collected, anthologized, or archived any further than the faded colophon and contents pages within each publication. Copies were scarce. Many have found their way to fireplaces, bird cages, trash bins, and destruction. Once back in New York City, I reconnected with Richard Hell, who I had begun working with in the early 90s in a band I put together called Dim Stars, which was Steve Shelley on drums, Hell on vocals, and Don Fleming and myself on guitars. Richard was aware of my penchant for relocating the poetry underground, even though in his world it was always nearby, as he had been in the city since the late 60s, drifting in and out of the various readings and happenings, as well as publishing Wanna Go Out, Dot Books by Teresa Stern, which is most likely, alongside Patti Smith's Seventh Heaven, Telegraph Books, the most significant small press document of mid-70s New York City underground poetry, where punk rock first comes into play. In actuality, Teresa Stern was a composite creation of both Hell and Verlaine, with the author bio that portrayed her as a Puerto Rican prostitute poet from somewhere in New Jersey. Richard had hit me to a New York City rare book dealer who had been buying and selling personal libraries of aging poets who either needed coin or were on their way out of the physical world. I beelined to Granary Books, meeting the proprietor, Steve Clay, and spent days running through reams of books, chapbooks, broadsides, postcards, LPs, newspapers, and announcement cards, like swimming in a pulchritude of golden poet sex text. Eventually, I'd find other dealers around the USA, such as the late Peter Howard, proprietor of Serendipity Books in Berkeley, California. Prior to my first visit to Serendipity, Byron gave me a list of names: D.A. Levy, T.L. Chris, R.J.S., David Meltzer, Clark Coolidge, Linda King, and about 200 others, to find books that were rumored to be hiding in there. When I walked in, Peter Howard immediately asked me if I needed help. He looked at my list, well worn from being jammed in my wallet all tour, and berated me for strolling into his store 20 minutes before closing and showing him this piece of paper. I politely told him that I would just look around a bit until closing time. I felt his energy bristling, and then he snapped and demanded the list again. He quickly made the announcement that he was in possession of publications by all these writers and suggested I come back again tomorrow. And I returned the next day as soon as he opened and spent a few hours before sound check pulling titles out from his splendiferous shelves. I carefully placed stacks upon stacks in front of Peter, and he penciled in very affordable prices in each one. He was a legend in the bookseller world and struck fear in many a neophyte, a tough character with a tender soul, and we talked about small press publishing and the state of poetry as lifestyle and devotion. When he would exhibit in the New York City antiquarian book fairs, I spent most of my time at his table, sifting through all the loose single-paper ephemera he had. There were boxes of letters from Ginsberg to obscure poets, bookmark announcements for regional poetry publications, great, lost, singular pieces of radical underground literature. When the online world became a promising outpost for sales, other heavy dealers of small press publishing who had gone silent for some years began to unleash their warehouses. I'd spend inordinate amounts of time parsing through the emailed files, checking off items that seemed to fit my expanding understanding of the connective tissues between the poets of Cleveland, Denver, Detroit, New York City, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Canada, and England. This is where I began my real education in poetry, by the vibratory and tactile aspect of the documents, to reading and processing the shared variables and experiments of how a poem exists on the page, the artful and personal take on how a line should break, or how vocabulary implies reality or fantasia. It was what I loved about music and songwriting, craft with liberation and community dialogue in its concerns towards life. When writing a poem, I referenced the work of published poets. It's not dissimilar learning to play rock and roll by listening to the records of Muddy Waters. There are signifiers of style that deal with traditional magic practices of the form that are only recognizable by reading or listening to as much of the history as possible. Advice I heard from a recorded talk by Ted Berrigan was to gather books of poetry by poets you love into your zone, or books loved by poets you love, or books by poets who have simply made you wonder. The same thing holds true with records and cassettes. I do not suggest buying CDs unless they are packaged with books, posters, fireworks, or love beads. All other digital formats are abominations. A poem is the linguistic expression of brain, heart, soul, skin, blood, spirit on the page with regard to rhythm, visual method, and vernacular passion. A poem can be laced into music and modified to accompany it if need be. Song lyrics are words and lines with a specific intention of making the song sing out in protest or in love, in abstraction or as a direct hit. It is fine to rhyme because rhyming sounds amazing in songs. Rhyming is precarious in a poem as it tends to draw imbalance to the sublime characters in the family of the poem. A song lyric can be anything, but it does not need to be a poem. All it needs is you, the music lover, to hear it and reach up and touch the writer. When you come home, hold each other and take time to be silent. Feel the heat of your body as a dialogue of salvation, respect, understanding, and desire, both dark and in divine light, comes to rejoice the day. I kneel before the green light of her singing crayon eyes is a line for a poem that never got beyond that first line. So I placed it in the first line of a Sonic Youth song. And with rhyme, it became a song lyric. And then I kiss her stomach, and it's then I realize her light is the night. I'm not blind. I believe in you. I see a green light. I was a young man in desire to devotion. Catholic crosses and statues of Mary seemed like gentle sentinels in my childhood. Rapacious love for touch and the bliss intellect of female consciousness and emotion is where I found identity. These songs and poems are for the angels of earth and goddess friends who whisper and play the fire that keeps us alive together. Thank you. I realized that I didn't really read any poetry, but I can read just a couple of short things if you want, and we'll stop. I once thought a good name for a band would be Orgy, but that's when I lived in the city. And then I thought a good name would be Children. That's when I looked out my kitchen window, drinking green and raspberry liquids and seeing for a moment through the hedge a mom and her child at play. The title of this next song is Meeting at Rex Roth's. Let's begin there. But let's not forget Marina Tsvetiva and the poem of the end. Electricity. I want to pull the car over so I can kiss you. When you reach from behind and kiss me. It is all I want is you. Kissing you under signs of cool stuff. When you let me kiss you. When you walk from my bathroom, I ask you if I can kiss you. And you open your blouse, letting me kiss you. A kiss under glass where every friend disappears. We haven't an enemy where no one knows electricity. Kissing, singing. Close your eyes and I force you into bed. Simple poems with simple words. Allow little time to be kissed by you, I wish. High Street. Pray for scoundrels as scoundrels pray. How does she fight for peace? How will she fight for freedom? Love sneaks round every corner, head on into the desperate energy of poverty. Poor boy teaches Led Zeppelin riffs to punk-haired girl with electric guitar. Pissed psychopath yells in the face of the devil. We play make-believe in Stoke Newington. The smile from the Turkish boy tending register at Shaheen is truth. 2014. Speaking. Pliant restraints, mind running, wild, old rain for infinite morning time, luscious eyes soothe dim thoughts. It's been a pleasure, your funny presence, risking ego to be crushed or aroused in tune with a perfectly capable cheap machine. Furious minutes in crowded upstairs parlors, alcohol splashed with ice streaming for positions and points of pride to be established. The curious time we have speaks in torrents of color and cream, seduces our jealous want, respect for the sake of love and belief. No faith, yes faith, all good teachers in regard, their eyes light gold, lights plain, wooing, secure, and a beneficent fantasy of charm. I draw to a close, the centered nexus feeling, Mrs. Brown, you've got a lovely daughter, and now we are adult, and now can only wait your call. Your skin reminds us. Testimony to color, wheels, always a twinkle in his brown eye, gleaming. Brown girl, our skin reminds you. Her skin, testimony to blues, color, blind blue, band appearing. Out of Nowhere, composed by Lester Young and played with sweet and street honor by Frank Lowe, released as one-sided 12-inch by Ecstatic Peace Records and Tapes. His Skin, loved through camera, eye of Valerie Wilmer, jazz, color cry testimonial to Afrofuturism, reeds and electronics in London studio. My Skin reminds the Mirror, New York City, 1978. Great beauty, beautiful artist. Your horn, mouth, dance, skin alive. Breathing, breathing, read her loving, love, lovely skin. Meditation students. She found a leaf behind the Harry Smith studio and with eyeliner wrote Naropa on it. I placed it on a torn photograph of Sid Vicious, photocopied it, and made a t-shirt. Wore it that night as we entered the weathered wooden doors that swung into gingerbread house, all stucco exterior, with a beat awning spelling out the tuning of my future guitar, C, B, G, B, top to bottom, or bottom to top. No one's clear. 5 strings, the 6th and O, as in O, as in on, as in thug, original music for underground gourmandizers. The joke, a mystic embrace in sweltering New York City summer. The son of Sam is taunting us. The t-shirt is perfect. Words are everywhere. Poetry is news, new, nude. Poetry is no, is O. Poetry equals opportunity. Tonight on stage, the nervous bass player is front and center and notorious and new. Strange choice for leader, believe it or not. And he barks, sings, howls, yowls something about sleeping like a kitten, working the graveyard shift, denying authority, and wanting to suck my eyelid. My girlfriend is amazing. Money is ridiculous. She moved here to hear poetry, to write about tonight. Love comes in spurts. Protest march lover. Killer licks. Olympia. Down for whatever. Throw away the key to the Dharma Center. I know nothing. Stack music. Breathing room. You'll never know what hit you. Chelsea light moving rings true. The ultimate adult, the inexhaustible treasure, the wrong idea meant to be. The obscene strut of your exit is where I choose to drift. Give me you, random house, introducing distance, the responsibility to return better than I remember. I don't like isolation. This room has heavy bleed. Okay. I'll do one more. Oh, yes, one more. These are my co-publisher's choices. This poem is called This Is What Is Awesome. 1, life. 2, today. 3, the twilight world of poetry. 4, the wild lover. Thank you, everybody. My pleasure.